Well, I assume that many of you have seen the photo series online called Humans of New York. It was started by a man named Brandon Stanton after 2008, and what it does is chronicle the lives of strangers that he meets on the New York City streets. He takes pictures of a woman sitting on a park bench and asks stories about her life, or of a family in the park, a couple at the museum, or someone riding the subway reading a book by themselves. It's become a successful website with millions of visitors. Its books are New York Times bestsellers. He's interviewed presidents of the United States, foreign dignitaries, has taken those stories of chronicling the lives of strangers in his beloved hometown of New York and has since shifted it to become an international effort. But this successful endeavor started because Brandon Stanton lost his job. It came out of an in-between moment for him, a between space, a waiting, a kind of advent. He had been a bond trader on Wall Street. He said he spent years and years of his life focused on nothing but money, and then the 2008 financial crisis struck and he was out of a job. All of a sudden, this man who had thought of nothing else but money was in an uncertain waiting period in his life. He went on unemployment, slept on an air mattress in a small apartment, and did the best he could to find a new job. But as he waited, he took up his hobby of photography. He started walking the streets of New York with his newfound free time and taking pictures of strangers. With their permission, he started posting them online, and he got some traction for the images of people in New York City. His website became more and more successful, and he's since traveled internationally and has done a project taking pictures of the faces of refugees across the world to raise money for efforts to make their lives more secure and safe and whole. But he said in a recent interview that his website, Humans of New York, took off only when he started sharing the stories of the people who were there. You see, he'd been focused on money and nothing else, marching in and out of Wall Street buildings, the tall, gleaming skyscrapers focused on one thing and one thing only, making money. And all of a sudden, when his life was thrown an unexpected turn, he had to pay attention to something different. He saw the human beings on the bench or on the subway or at the park. He saw them as if for the first time. He could pay attention to them in a way without his job or without his focus on his job that he never did before. And the website took off, he said, once he started including their stories along with the pictures. He said that people didn't resonate only with those successes or money or power, but that people started to comment and share his site when he would share stories of people who were open and honest about their weaknesses and their strengths, their failures along with their successes, their fears along with their courage. Something about that was more compelling. It only became as popular as it did when we saw the whole story, the whole human underneath the photo. Like Brandon in his life, I think it's easy, especially in our culture of individualism and success, the worship of money or power, to just simply be taught to pay attention to the wrong things. We can look at a city like New York and see its gleaming skyscrapers, its center of financial power and wealth, of influence, and miss that the real story is happening in the person on the bench or at the park. And miss paying attention to the life of a human being much like us. It's easy in our culture, which rightly celebrates progress and success, to pay attention to those. and not to the value that failure might have in our lives. To stop and pay attention to the moments of our life that do not feel easy or successful or powerful, but rather to pay attention to and learn from the places that feel fragile, the places in the shadows, the places that feel poor or weak or sick, with the knowledge that there's something holy to be learned in them too. You see, that's one of the things that I love so much about the Advent and Christmas story. Sure, there's lights on the trees and there's singing of carols. There's often families in normal years gathered around presents or the fire. There's a story of hope and a child born into the world who will become a teacher of peace. And yet, that story says that the real story is the one happening underneath the surface. The Advent story, the Christmas story, is not a story of conventional power, wealth, or wisdom. The teacher who changes the world is born a poor child to a teenage, unwed mother in occupied territory who likely crosses over international borders without papers, fleeing violence. When they do give birth, the child likely grows up to be a homeless, illiterate rabbi with a small group of friends who preaches a love so radical that it becomes basically illegal. He casts no one outside of the circle of care or concern and is executed as a death row inmate crucified by the state. And that's the story of hope and power and a new world. Not in the gleaming skyscrapers, but rather in a story that says there is power in the story of a poor family. There is hope that is to be found among the outcasts, the marginalized, the poor, the sick, the rebels, and the refugees. It is a story that says if you stop looking in the obvious places, start looking in the shadows of the world and in your life, you might find something very holy there too. An unconventional hero in an unconventional time whose gentle but brave and strong dedication to love changes everything. You see, I think when we read that story, it also challenges us to pay attention to the parts of our life that might feel poor or sick. The parts of our lives and ourself that don't conform to conventional success or power or wealth or status. It asks us to pay attention to our longing, to the moments when we feel that we have felt short, to our pain, our waiting, our desire for a world and a life that we don't have yet, and to say, what do you have to teach us too? You see, also in America, I think, and in the West in general, we are trained to want pain to go away, to want uncertainty to become certainty, and to have no waiting at all. And that's just not what the Advent story teaches. Granted, chronic pain and suffering, being marginalized or outcast, those are not good things in and of themselves. Sometimes there is nothing good to be found in them. But this story calls us to say, what can I learn about myself? What does pain ask me to pay attention to? When I'm waiting, what kind of life do I truly want? In the in-between spaces, what does it teach me about what's worthy, what I desire, and what I can use my life on? There is a man named Albert Murray who is a scholar on jazz and the blues, and he has an idea of antagonistic cooperation in a book about heroism, the classic hero's journey and the blues. And what he says is that built into the story of the blues is the idea that who we are is formed by paying attention to our struggle. That who we are, our strength, our very self is forged by not ignoring the parts of our lives that are difficult, by engaging the shadow part, the waiting part, the pain part, the poor part, the Advent part, and asking, what do you have to teach me? He uses the narrative that we often get from old school hero stories. Someone with a sword in hand slaying a dragon. And he says that often what we do is pay attention to the shining, strong sword and the hero who slays the dragon, and everything is okay in the end. And we ignore the fact that that sword was forged in fire with a hammer and anvil that beat it into its state. That the hero cannot be the hero without the dragon and the fight. He says this: the image of a sword being forged is inseparable from what he calls antagonistic cooperation. The fire in the forging process, like the dragon who the hero must always encounter, is by its very nature antagonistic, but it's also cooperative at the same time. For all its violence, the fire does not destroy the metal that becomes the sword. It functions precisely to strengthen and prepare it to hold its battle edge. Even as all but the withering fire drake prepares the questing hero for trials and adventures. He concludes by saying, the function of the hammer and the anvil is to beat the sword into shape. Even as the most vicious challengers, no less than the most cooperatively rugged sparring mates, jab and clinch and punch a potential prize fighter into championship condition. The point is that we can pay attention to the world in a way that doesn't give us the wisdom of the blues, of Advent, of the shadow part, the waiting part, the pain part, the poor part of our life, which holds just as much holy in it. We can pay attention to the hero and the shining sword and forget that they were forged in fire and a fight. Sometimes we don't want to pay attention to the forces that have forged us. We want to look to the tall skyscrapers and conventional notions of success. But I promise you, if you stop and pay attention to what has forged you, what fire, what hammer and anvil, what fight, what dragon, what quest has given you the strength you have, you'll look at the next one entirely differently. The next time there's a moment of waiting, the next time there's a moment that feels like spiritual or financial or emotional poverty in your life, the next time there's a dragon at the gates or you feel like you are being hammered against fire, if you pay attention to the way that those have forged your strength in the past, you might find something holy in them the next time. Because those Advent moments in our lives don't just happen once a year. I know you already know that. I don't have to tell you that there's another moment in your life where the world that you want, the life that you want, the person you want, the job you want, the self you want, the body you want, anything at all feels like it's just out of reach. I don't have to tell you that there will be moments in the midst of summer where the days feel very short and there's plenty of shadow. I don't have to tell you that there will be people and encounters in your life that will feel like dragons at the gates and you might not feel like much of a hero. But if you can learn to pay attention, To stop and see how those moments have forged you in the past and how you came back and you are still alive and making a life that is worthy and meaningful. Then, like the people who saw God in the midst of a poor child in the desert, among the poorest and the sick of their time, just like them, you might see where the holy is working in all of your life. There's a good story happening in you too. Whether you're a human of New York or Dallas or Paris or Barcelona, wherever you live, there's a good story happening in you. My guess is that you too have been forged by fire. Pay attention to what strengthens you. Turn that fire into cooperation. Turn that fight into something that makes you stronger for the next time. Pay attention to what has brought you thus far. In the Advent story, hope in the shortest days and the longest nights will mean something more this year and all years. May it be so. Amen.